Thank you.
Satish.
Thank you, Prithvi. Thank you, Mr. Satish. I thank and acknowledge the organizers of this series of lectures by Madras Tax Bar. The topic which I've chosen for today, a very basic one, pleadings in CPC. I thought that the slot that is given to me should be made useful to the youngsters and make them understand the importance of pleadings, as pleadings is the foundation and will be the bedrock for every litigation throughout its life, for all the hierarchy of courts and even at the execution stage. And at the commencement itself, I would say my lecture is aimed at an audience, not the senior practitioners, not the seasoned practitioners, but to the raw juniors who have stepped into the profession, so that as budding lawyers, they will know the importance of CPC and pleadings. This is what Justice Sundar said when MBA Academy invited him to give a lecture on Arbitration and Conciliation Act. He said that this is not for the seniors, this is for the juniors. So I also start on the same way. I propose to divide the topic for today's lecture into certain parts. A, what are pleadings and what is the purpose it has to achieve? B, what are the basic rules of pleadings? 1, what should be there in a pleading? 2, what is not necessary to be in a pleading? C, special rules relating to pleadings prescribed in CPC. D, specific types of suits like money suits, property suits, specific performance suits. In such suits, what is the additional pleading that is required? That is D. And E, written statement. And thereafter, if time permits, I will also run through Order 6, Rule 17, amendment, and Order 7, Rule 11, rejection of plaint. All these topics which I have divided flow from Order 6, Order 7, and Order 8 CPC. If you see Civil Procedure Code, it is a procedural law. So far as pleadings are concerned, it is like a guide. It does not lay any substantive provision. A junior, if he carefully reads Order 6, Order 7, and Order 8, he will know in simple language it has been stated what should be there in a pleading, what is necessary, what is not necessary, and therefore, if an advocate, when he meets a client, gets all the factual instructions from him, and then works on the law which is applicable, whether it is Specific Relief Act, or it is Rent Control Act, or it is the Eastman's Act, or Transfer of Property Act, lay his hands on the correct law, and thereafter find out what he has got to establish for getting a success in the case. Then, if he reads Order 6, Order 7, Order 8, they will know as a plaintiff or as a defendant what should be there in a pleading and what is not necessary in a pleading. And now coming to part A, what is pleading and what purpose it plays in a litigation? Pleadings are in the form of a plaint. When a plaintiff comes to court, he states his case. That is called a plaint. When summons are served on the defendant, defendant enters appearance and he files his statement of the case. That is called written statement. After the written statement is filed, if anything contained in the written statement needs a further explanation by the plaintiff, then he is entitled to file a reply. That is called the reply statement. Therefore, basically, plaint, written statement, and reply statement, these are the three forms of pleadings in a suit. The importance of pleadings is that it is the foundation of the case of the plaintiff or the defendant. 2, the necessity of pleadings is that the opposite party should know what case he has got to meet. The defendant should know what is the case of the plaintiff. The plaintiff should know what is the case of the defendant. And therefore, rules have been framed in CPC as to what is necessary and what should be included in a plaint, so that the opposite party is not taken by surprise at the time of trial or at the time of argument. And the pleadings forms the bedrock of the case at all stages of the litigation. The plaint and written statement does not lose significance after the suit is decreed or dismissed. At the first appellate stage, at the second appellate stage, even before the Honorable Supreme Court, the question which they will ask is, what you are arguing, is it forming part of the pleading? Without pleading, please don't make any argument here. The courts will reject it. Therefore, what has to be pleaded has to be pleaded at the earliest point of time, and resort to other ways of amendment and things like that has got to be avoided. Problems may arise even at the stage of execution if the pleading is not proper. For example, if identity of the property is not properly set out in the plaint, and without noticing that, the suit goes on, and at the execution stage, when a dispute is raised saying that the decree is with regard to some other property and therefore you cannot come and execute this, then a whole lot of litigation will arise saying that this is the property which I intended to be the part of the plaint. Both parties have understood that, therefore you should not throw my case at the execution stage. Therefore, to avoid all these things, at the inception itself, the plaint should be properly drafted by giving in all the particulars, and the framers of law, when they have done it as early as they framed the CPC, they have taken pains in guiding the advocates as to what should be stated, how it should be stated. And that is why pleadings assumes importance. And that is why I thought that pleadings should be a part of this lecture for the juniors. And the next job which pleadings will do is that after the plaint and written statement has been filed, the pleadings are complete. When the pleadings are complete, the parties will know which part of his case has been admitted by the other side, which part of his case has been denied by the other side. And if the defendant comes forward with his case, then the plaintiff will know what is the defense which the defendant is taking, and the court will be able to frame the issues for trial. Therefore, another important thing, another important role which pleadings plays in the process of litigation and adjudication of disputes is that both the parties as well as the court will know what are the admitted facts, what are the disputed facts, so that the trial can be restricted to the disputed facts alone and the time of the court can be saved. Then there is one cardinal principle of law, that no amount of evidence can be looked into unless it is supported by a pleading. There may be cases where the district municip, unmindful of this fact, might have admitted evidence, might have decreed the suit. In first appeal, the court might have, the subordinate judge or the district judge might have confirmed it. But at the appellate stage, if this question is taken, or even at the Supreme Court stage, if it, I've got one or two cases which I'll take you through at the later part of my lecture, where at the Supreme Court stage, they say this plea ought not to be allowed, this evidence ought not to be looked into, since there is no pleading, and therefore, even without remanding the case, decrees which have been granted have been set aside by the courts. Now, coming to the first part of the rules, that is B in my division, the basic rules of pleadings. It is set out in Order 6 CPC. First, the basic rule is that facts only should be part of the pleading and not the law. This is stated in Order 6, Rule 2. It also says that evidence need not be pleaded, only the facts have to be pleaded. For example, in a money suit is filed against son of the borrower. Parties are Hindus. There is a doctrine called doctrine of pious obligation, where son of a Hindu, after the father dies, is obliged to settle the lawful debts incurred by his father. Therefore, this is the law. The fact is that on so-and-so date, so-and-so amount of money was lent by the plaintiff to the defendant's father, defendant's father did not repay, defendant's father died on so and so date, leaving assets in the hands of the defendant. This is the fact. If this CPC says that you don't plead the law, you plead the facts, judges will take care of the law. Judges will apply the law to the facts. And therefore, in the plaint, it is not necessary to plead that the defendant, being the son of the borrower and they being Hindus, there is a doctrine called pious obligation. Under that pious obligation, the defendant as the son is bound to pay the money. This is part of law which need not be pleaded. It is sufficient if it is pleaded that he is the son of the borrower, borrower died, parties are Hindus, and therefore he is liable to pay. The existence of the doctrine of pious obligation, which is part of law, need not be the part of the plaint. Then the next basic rule is that facts have to be pleaded and not the evidence. As I told you, Order 6, Rule 2 puts it in so many words. All the material facts which are necessary to get relief should be pleaded, not the evidence through which the facts are going to be proved. There is a slight difference between material facts and the material particulars. Material particulars are the evidence on the basis of which the material facts are to be proved. All this is only for the purpose of keeping the plaint in a concise form. If parties start pleading the evidence through which they are going to prove the facts, then the plaint itself will run to 30-40 pages, which is not necessary. And CPC makes so many rules only for the purpose of ensuring that the pleadings are in a concise form. An example for facts alone need be pleaded and evidence need not be pleaded. Take the case of a suit for recovery of possession based on title. It is sufficient recovery of possession and damages based on title. The facts of the case are: the plaintiff is the owner of the property. He has grown trees in that. The trees are yielding coconuts. The defendant, who does not have title to the property, has encroached into the property, cut all the trees, and is attempting to put up a factory in that place. Therefore, a suit is filed for declaration of title, recovery of possession, and injunction. In this, the material facts will be how the plaintiff got title to the property, whether it is by purchase or it is by inheritance or it is by any other mode of exchange or any other mode by which he has acquired the property. From whom he has acquired the property, the date on which he has acquired the property, the date on which he is in possession of the property. These are the pleadings. And the date on which the defendant has encroached the property and cut the trees and caused the damage. This is the quantum of damage which he has caused, and therefore I am entitled to the relief. These are the material facts. These facts can be proved by examining the neighbors who were witnesses to the felling of trees by the defendant and his attempt to put up constructions therein. Therefore, these witnesses who will be the witnesses giving evidence for the purpose of proving the material facts need not be pleaded in the plaint. I need not say when I'm drafting the plaint that I am the owner of the property, I am in possession, the defendant who does not have title to the property has come on so and so date, and this was witnessed by Mr. A and Mr. B, and they have given complaint to me, and through that I have come to know of it. These are matters which are evidence. If the assertions in the plaint are denied by the defendant, then we have to prove it. For the purpose of proving it, we can bring in those witnesses, and those witnesses are the evidence through which we are going to plead it. We are going to prove the material facts need not be pleaded. This is another basic rule. There are two legal terms for this: facta probanda. Facts which have to be proved, they are the material facts. Facta probentia, P-R-O-B-A-N-T-I-A. Facts by which the material facts are to be proved. That is the evidence. The difference between facta probanda and facta probentia has been elucidated by the Honorable Supreme Court in the judgment in 2007, 3 SEC 617. It is a case arising under the Representatives of People's Act, where an election petition was filed for setting aside the election on the grounds of corrupt practices. An application was filed for rejecting the petition, pleading that the material particulars of the facts have not been pleaded, and therefore the election petition has to be rejected. There, the Honorable Supreme Court drew a line of distinction between material facts and material particulars by which the facts are going to be established. And they said that the pleadings in that case was sufficient. The material facts were there. The witnesses through whom it is going to be established and the particulars through which the facts are going to be established is a matter for evidence that can be a part of trial, and therefore the election petition cannot be set aside, the petition cannot be rejected, and the order of the High Court was set aside and the election petition was restored. And one more basic rule is that Order 6, Rule 13, where there is a presumption arising under law. In the plain, we need not plead that I am having the advantage of the presumption. If the factual basis is pleaded, the court will automatically apply the presumption which is available to you. For example, if execution of the promissory note or a negotiable instrument is admitted, then under section 118 of the Negotiable Instruments Act, it is presumed that it is a document supported by consideration. We need not in our plaint, when we say that I lent money on so and so date and the defendant has acknowledged the debt by executing a promissory note, and therefore under section 118 there is a presumption that the promissory note is supported by consideration. That plea is not required. But then Order 6, Rule 13 immediately adds a rider. Even though the presumption need not be pleaded, in cases where there is a denial of the basic fact prior to filing of the suit itself, assume a case where I have issued a notice demanding the amount which is liable to be paid by the defendant on a bill of exchange or on a promissory note. If the defendant has issued a reply denying the consideration and pleading that it was executed under different circumstances, under those circumstances, Order 6, Rule 13, I will just read Order 6, Rule 13 for the benefit of the audience. Neither party in any pleading allege the matter of fact which law presumes in his favor or as to which the burden of proof lies upon the other side, unless the same has first been specifically denied. Example, consideration for a bill of exchange where the plaintiff sues only on a bill and not for consideration as a substantive ground of claim. Therefore, if there is a specific denial before the suit is filed, then the pleading has got to be different. The pleading has got to be more specific, and mere pleading that a bill of exchange is signed or a promissory note is signed is not sufficient. You will also have to add to the pleadings that there is a presumption under section 118. He is denying consideration, whereas under section 118, there is a presumption it is supported by consideration. Only then the defendant will be able to meet his case. Then, to sum up with regard to the basic rules, facts alone should be pleaded, not the evidence, not the law. Presumptions need not be pleaded unless it is specifically denied. And then the cause of action. The cause of action is like a summary of the entire plaintiff's case. A plaintiff is entitled to come to court under section 9 for redressal of any civil right. There should be a cause of action entitling him for a relief. That cause of action should be specifically pleaded. If it is a case for injunction with regard to immovable property, the cause of action will be, sorry, am I online?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, there was a call that came in.
No problem.
Cause of action, if it is a case for injunction, the date on which the defendant is attempting to interfere and trespass into your property. If it is a case for declaration of title, the date on which the defendant has denied your title and claims title in himself. If it is a case for specific performance, the date on which you are entitled to purchase the property and the date on which the defendant has denied executing the sale deed in your favor and is refusing to execute the sale deed in your favor. Therefore, all the facts which are material running up to the cause of action is I am having a right, that right is denied, and therefore I am coming to court. All this should be stated in the cause of action paragraph, and thereafter the plaint should contain the jurisdiction paragraph saying that how the court has got jurisdiction, territorial and pecuniary, and the court fees that is payable under what section of the Court Fees Act it is payable, and thereafter the relief portion. Then the other portions are verification, all that is there in the form that is prescribed. And one more important thing that has been done in the 2002 amendment to CPC is all the documents on which the plaintiff relies will have to be filed along with the plaint itself. That is Order 7, Rule 14. You cannot withhold the documents and file it at a later point of time. I'll come to it when I'm coming to Order 7. Then, having now stated the basic rules, there are certain special rules of pleadings in respect of special instances contained in Order 6 itself. That is part C of our lecture. The first one is, if the case of the plaintiff or the defendant is based on fraud, misrepresentation, breach of trust, undue influence, or mental state of mind, then the pleading should contain specific particulars. This is contained in Order 6, Rule 4 and Order 6, Rule 10 CPC. I'll read Order 6, Rule 4. In all cases in which the party pleading relies on any misrepresentation, fraud, breach of trust, willful default, undue influence, and in all other cases in which particulars may be necessary beyond as are exemplified in the forms aforesaid, particulars with date, items if necessary shall be in the pleading. That is, a vague or general statement is not sufficient. For example, if I am challenging a document which I have executed, as the signature was obtained under undue influence, coercion, or by misrepresenting it, saying that it is only a gift deed which you are executing, whereas they took it as if it is a sale deed and consideration has been paid to me, or if it is any other, the nature of the document itself has been changed, or saying that they took the document as if it is only a mortgage, whereas they have taken it as if it is a sale deed. It is not sufficient if I merely plead that the document was taken from me under undue influence or coercion. There, necessary pleadings has got to be exemplified. Only then the defendant will be able to meet the case and defend it effectively. Therefore, a special rule has been brought out in Order 6, Rule 4. If you are pleading misrepresentation, fraud, undue influence, willful default, coercion, etc., or any mental state of mind, that is also there in Rule 10 of Order 6. They say that the pleading should not be general, it should not be vague, it should be clear with material particulars. What are the material particulars? You will have to plead the misrepresentation was done on so-and-so date, at so-and-so place, by so-and-so, and I believed what he stated was true, and according to his statement, I acted, and subsequently I found that it is a total misrepresentation. Unless these facts are there, then as per Order 6, Rule 4, you will not be entitled to plead this, and your case may be knocked off at the appellate stage or even at the Supreme Court, even if you have succeeded in the lower courts. Therefore, it is very important that when any client comes to you saying that there is a document but it is vitiated by these circumstances, be careful enough to get all the details from him, how it happened, when it happened, in whose presence it happened, and all that should be stated in the plate. There is one important case for that, 2008, 15 SEC, page 673. The important paragraphs are para 29, 32, 40, and 41. It is a case where, after a long drawn litigation in a family partition dispute, the parties had arrived at a settlement. The settlement was also recorded as a compromise by the court, and a decree was passed in terms of the compromise. Thereafter, one of the parties to the compromise filed a suit saying that the property which is allotted to them is a pittance compared to the property which has been allotted to the other side, and fraud was played, misrepresentation was made, and the signature was obtained in the compromise, and therefore set aside the compromise, restore the old suit, and take it up for hearing. The Honorable Supreme Court said that since it is a suit for setting aside a family settlement, for reopening the suit on the grounds of fraud and misrepresentation, the mere plea that the compromise was signed under undue influence, coercion, or fraud is not sufficient. Specific reference was made by the Honorable Supreme Court to Order 6, Rule 4, and the entire argument on that plea was negative, and the plaintiff was non-suited. Therefore, whenever you plead undue influence, coercion, or misrepresentation, etc., your pleading should be not general, it should not be vague, it should contain the specific detail. This is a very, very important and cardinal rule in CPC.
Sir, I'm sorry, sir, to interrupt. Sir, can you just repeat the citation, sir? I just put it in the calendar. Sir, sorry, sir.
2008,
2008,
15 SEC,
15 SEC,
Supreme Court cases 673.
673. And paragraph, sir?
Paragraph 29, 32,
20. Yes, sir.
40, and 41.
Thank you very much.
41 will be very important.
Yes, sir.
Where they lay down what is the importance of Order 6, Rule 4.
Thank you very much, sir.
Then the next one is Order 6, Rule 6 is also a special rule. If there is a condition precedent for getting relief, then the facts relating that condition precedent has to be pleaded. You know, if a suit has got to be filed against the government, then a notice has to be issued under Section 80 CPC, or you should file an application for exemption from issuing such notice in view of urgency. Therefore, a plaint will be incomplete if you file the suit against the government without pleading that I have issued a notice under Section 80 CPC on so-and-so date. It has been served on the officer on so-and-so date. This is the reply. The contents of the reply are right or wrong, or no reply has been received, and it is 2 months since the date on which the notice has been served on them, and now I am filing the suit. Therefore, condition precedent for filing a suit under Section 80 CPC against the government is that a notice has got to be issued. Similarly, under the Rent Control Act, where strict rules of pleadings are not applicable, but still the principles of CPC is applicable. Under the old Rent Control Act, now these conditions are not there for getting relief. Now the law has completely changed. Let us not go into that now. But the importance of pleading for a condition precedent, for that purpose, I am referring to this. For entitling eviction under owner's occupation ground, you have to plead and prove that I am not in occupation of a building which is owned by me for the same purpose. If it is additional accommodation, you have to plead that I am in occupation of part of the same property, and the hardship that will be caused to me if eviction is not ordered will outweigh the advantage which the tenant will get if the eviction petition is dismissed. Therefore, the balance of hardship has got to be pleaded as per the proviso contained in section 10(3)(c). In one classic case, eviction petition was filed. Note down the citation, 1999, 7 SCC 382. In that case, the landlord filed the petition for eviction for owner's occupation by referring to section 10(3)(a). In the High Court, a petition was filed for amending the section as 10(3)(c) because it was found on facts that he was in occupation of part of the property. Therefore, section 10(3)(a) will strictly not apply. But the High Court permitted the amendment and substituting the section 10(3)(a) as 10(3)(c) and ordered eviction. The tenant took the matter to the Honorable Supreme Court on SLP. The Honorable Supreme Court said that 10(3)(c) is an independent provision. It has got conditions precedent that you have to plead that the hardship that will be caused to you by dismissing the eviction petition will be more than the advantage which the tenant will have by continuing the property. This is a statutory requirement. Therefore, where law requires a statutory compliance or a statutory satisfaction for getting relief, unless the facts relating to that satisfaction is pleaded, then the provision section 10(3)(c) itself cannot be pleaded. You cannot merely amend the petition from 10(3)(a) to 10(3)(c) without the basic pleading for the condition precedent. The condition precedent here is the advantage, the balance of convenience, the advantage will outweigh the hardship that will be caused. That is the pleading that has got to be there. Since this was not there, the Honorable Supreme Court set aside the order of eviction, which was granted by the High Court, and dismissed the eviction petition. A plea was made in the Honorable Supreme Court. At least remand it to the trial court. I will amend the pleading. I will include these pleadings, and then let parties be given opportunity to lead evidence, and thereafter let the matter be decided. Even that the Supreme Court did not say, no, it is your fault. Under a specific reference was made to Order 6, Rule 6, where there is a condition precedent. You have to plead the condition precedent. Unless the condition precedent is pleaded, the evidence cannot be looked into, and the relief that is granted by the court cannot be allowed to be sustained. Therefore, they set aside. Therefore, now you see what the consequence will be if a pleading which has got to be in a particular form is not in that form. Everybody knows how hard it will be to get an order of eviction in respect of a tenant in a city. After the rent controller, appellate authority, High Court, and Supreme Court, after winning in 3 courts, if you go to the Supreme Court and you lose a case for want of a pleading, it is like for want of a nail, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the war was lost. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the war was lost, and ultimately the battle itself was lost. Therefore, my advice is that after the facts are collected and after the law which is applicable is seen, please see CPC once again. No harm in not going through CPC. Please see CPC once again and see what has got to be pleaded, what is not pleaded. Avoid any subsequent damage at a later point of time. Then, one more rule, specific rule, is that Order 6, Rule 16 CPC. Avoid scandalous pleadings. Avoid unnecessary, vexatious, and frivolous pleadings. See, what is required is the material facts. You know the material facts, you know what has got to be proved. Unnecessarily, you should not enter into accusing the defendant with unnecessary words, use harsh language, use scandalous language. If all that is done, if an application is filed, that part of the plaint is going to be rejected under Order 6, Rule 16. Therefore, your plaint should be worded in such a way that it does not annoy the court or annoy the other party. The purpose of pleading is only to inform the other side of the case which he has got to meet. It is not to accuse him of what wrong he has done. Somebody wanted a repeat of the citation. That citation is 1999 7 SCC 382. Then, now we come to Order 7. Order 7 says what are the nature of pleading which is required with regard to specific kinds of suits. First, Order 7, Rule 1 says the structure of the suit, what are all required. That is just jurisdiction, cost title, things like that. We'll ignore that. In a money suit, Order 7, Rule 2, where plaintiff seeks for recovery of money, the plaintiff shall state the precise amount claimed. You cannot say approximately so and so is due. You have to say the exact amount which is due. And not only that, you should also plead the amount should be stated in words as well as in numerals as well as in words. That is required. And when it comes to suits for immovable property, Order 7, Rule 3, where the subject matter of suit is immovable property, the plaintiff shall contain a description of the property sufficient to identify it, and in such a case, property can be identified by boundaries and survey numbers. The boundaries and survey numbers also should be pleaded. I said even at the inception that the importance of pleading with regard to immovable property, you will face it sometimes at the stage of execution. By mistake, the boundary might not have been correctly stated. We would have succeeded in the trial court. And when it goes for execution, at the execution stage, the defendant may take a plea. See the boundaries. Your decree is in respect of some other property. Now you are wanting to execute some other property. Then you will have to run around for amending the pleadings, all that is a very uphill task. Therefore, if the plaintiff's counsel had seen Order 7, Rule 3, he would have known that the property has got to be properly described, and he will describe it with proper boundaries, and he would taken care in doing it correctly. And so far as immovable property is concerned, as I told you earlier, the material facts will be how the property title has been acquired, from whom, by what document, and how it has flown, how you are holding possession of the property. All these has got to be pleaded. In one case, 2012, 5 SEC, page 370, the Supreme Court has spent 24 paragraphs on the importance of pleadings. Paragraph 53 to 77. The most important paragraph is paragraph 70. There, just 1 minute. I'll open that citation and come back to you. Yes, you can see specific reference to para 70. They say that unless the facts on the basis of which you are pleaded has been pleaded correctly and supported by the documents, then you would not be entitled to argue a case different from what you already pleaded. You cannot take an alternative argument at a later point of time and say, if not on that basis, please give it to me on some other basis. That is not permitted. Your pleading, so far as immovable property is concerned, has got to be very clear. And if it is not properly pleaded, then you are not entitled to relief. That is the judgment in 2012, 5 SEC, page 370. And the documents on the basis of which you are seeking your remedy should also be filed along with the plaint. That is also emphasized in that judgment. And then another rule is Order 7, Rule 6 CPC, where you are pleading exemption from the law of limitation. You will have to plead the factual details on the basis of which you are claiming exemption. Order 7, Rule 6 says where the suit is instituted after the expiration of the period prescribed by law of limitation, the plaintiff shall show the ground upon which the exemption from such law is claimed. These rules, I say, they are specific rules only because they are all different from the general rules which we stated earlier. Generally, the rule is that plead your facts, you need not plead the law. But then, when a suit is filed after 3 years for recovery of money, then if you plead that the limitation period is still alive because some part of that is exempted under some provision of law, then you would have to specifically plead the provision of law by which you say that your suit is still within time. There may be cases where section 14 may be pleaded, where the plaintiff is bona fide pursuing his remedies before another forum which does not have jurisdiction, and later on he understood that the forum before which he has been fighting so long does not have jurisdiction. Therefore, the period that has been spent in that litigation before the forum which does not have jurisdiction has got to be excluded. That is contained in section 14. Therefore, if in a particular case you have been spending your time before another forum which does not have jurisdiction, then you will have to plead that specifically. That is what Order 6, Rule 6 says. Similarly, if you plead frauds, that I was not aware of my right with regard to the property because of a fraud which was played by the defendant on me, I came to know of it only now. Therefore, the date on which you came to know about the fraud that has been played by the other party, then that will be the date on which your cause of action will arise. That is provided under section 17 of the Limitation Act. Therefore, if you are relying upon any of the exemptions contained, law of limitation is there. For every suit, the period has been prescribed. Therefore, you are expected to file the suit within that period. If you are filing it beyond that period, the suit will not be entertained because under section 3 of the Limitation Act, the court is bound to throw the plaint or throw the suit if it is barred by limitation. Therefore, you have to specifically plead that even though on the face of it, it may look as if the suit is not within time. However, on account of this reason, I am entitled to the benefit of this provision of the Limitation Act by which I am exempted, and this period has got to be exempted, and if that is so done, my suit is within time. That is a specific plea which has got to be done. Then there is one more special kind of suit which very rarely may come, but still we should know that. For filing a suit on a promissory note, the basic document on which you have to file the suit is the promissory note. If the promissory note is not available, or the negotiable instrument on the basis of which you are filing the suit is not available, it is not as if that you don't have remedy at all. You need not tell the client, Adilla, therefore suit poda mudiyadhu, please poitu vaanga. You need not say that. You can still advise him. There is a provision contained in Order 6, Rule 16 CPC. It says that where the suit is founded upon a negotiable instrument and it is proved that the instrument is lost and an indemnity is given by the plaintiff to the satisfaction of the court against the claims of any other person upon such instrument, the court may pass a decree. Therefore, what is necessary is that you have to plead that at the time of lending, the promissory note was executed or bill of exchange was executed by the defendant. It was lost subsequently. And as soon as I came to know it is lost, I have lodged a police complaint. And I undertake to indemnify any party who may suffer the loss in case the instrument is found in the hands of somebody else. That is, I come to court by saying that the instrument is lost. Subsequently, it may happen that I might have endorsed it in favor of somebody else, and that somebody else might file a suit subsequently, and therefore on one promissory note, 2 decrees cannot be granted. Therefore, in such a case, law says that take an indemnity from the plaintiff. Therefore, if you come to court on the basis of a lost promissory note, your plaint has to contain an indemnity clause also. You have to say that I undertake to indemnify any person who may suffer a loss if the promissory note or the negotiable instrument on the basis of which I am filing the suit is found in the hands of somebody else and somebody else makes a claim. Then, one important thing which I told you earlier, Order 7, Rule 14, as amended in 2002. Earlier it was 14.1 and 14.2. Documents on the basis of which relief is sought for is 14.1. Documents which are to be relied upon at a later point of time is 14.2. Now the 14.1, 14.2 business has been done away with, and one rule, 14.1, and they say that where the plaintiff sues upon a document or relies upon a document in his possession or power in support of the claim, all the documents shall be listed, and whatever is available has got to be produced in court, and or copies of the same has got to be produced. If the document is not in your possession and in your custody, you have to plead in whose possession or custody the document is. Suppose I am filing a suit for declaration of title. The plaintiff has mortgaged the property with the bank, and therefore the original documents are with the bank. You are bound to produce your original title deed to the court. If you are not producing your original title deed to the court, then as per Order 7, Rule 14.1, you have to say that the document is mine, it was with me, I have deposited with the bank by way of a mortgage, and therefore it is under control of the bank. Such a plea is also required. Therefore, these are the important rules contained in Order 7 with regard to pleadings. Now, we go to the next part of the lecture, that is E, written statement. So far as written statement is concerned, before going into what the contents of the written statement should be, Rule 1 of Order 8 is very important because it prescribes a period of limitation for filing the written statement. Even without going to Order 8 Rule 1, in practice, it is seen, and most of us know, we don't treat the plaintiff and the defendant as a client on the same on par. When it is the plaintiff, we take immediate efforts to get the instructions, draft the plaint, read it, finalize it, file it immediately because we want some emergent interim order. But when it is a defendant who comes to us, I'm telling this only in practice this happens. We say that, yes, vakalat kuduthittu ponga, vakalatha pottalam, we'll take time for filing written statement. And then we lose track of that. Some other important matter will come, we'll start concentrating on that. And then we'll file the written statement after a long time with condemnation of delay. In the High Court, we'll see there are written statements filed with 900 days delay, 1000 days delay, 1200 days delay. My request to all the audience here and all the juniors is that please don't do that. Law says file the written statement within 30 days. Treat the defendant also as if he is coming to you with a new case. For as a defendant, for him it is a new case. You may think that he is only a defendant, we will take time, there is some other case which we have to file tomorrow. But so far as that client is concerned, it is an important case for him. Therefore, in practice, we should also cultivate the habit of treating the defendant also on par with the plaintiff and get the instruction from the defendant immediately. What is his case? Prepare the written statement and file it within the 30 days. Proviso to that says that it shall be filed within 30 days, or if sufficient cause is shown, the time can be extended not more than 90 days. The wording is provided that where the defendant fails to file the written statement within the set period of 30 days, he shall be allowed to file the same on such other day as may be specified by the court for the reasons to be recorded in writing, but which shall not be later than 90 days from the date of service of summons. Therefore, 30 days is initially allowed, or if sufficient cause is shown, 90 days is allowed. This was a very draconian provision. And when a whole lot of amendments were made to CPC in 2002, a hue and cry was raised that the parties will be prejudiced. And several provisions was challenged before the Honorable Supreme Court by the Supreme Court Advocate Bar Association. The Honorable Supreme Court, in the case in 2005, 6 SCC, page 344, interpreting Order 8 Rule 1 and Order 8 Rule 10 CPC together. Since Order 8 Rule 10 says, if the written statement is not filed within the time that is granted under Rule 1, then the court may pass such order as it thinks fit. Therefore, interpreting the court may pass such order as it thinks fit, the Honorable Supreme Court, with a laudable object of giving one more opportunity to the defendant, said that even this 90 days need not be treated as mandatory. It can be treated as directory, but however, not as a matter of course. Ensure that the written statements are filed in time so that the life of litigation is short and parties are not made to roam in the courts for adjudication of their disputes. There should be a time frame, and therefore delay may be condoned in exceptional cases. Therefore, let us not fall back on those exceptional circumstances and plead those exceptional circumstances. Order 8, Rule 1 gives 30 days time or 90 days time for filing the written statement. It shall be done within that time. And one more thing here is that so far as the High Court is concerned, not only the High Court, any other commercial court, now an amendment has been made to Order 8 Rule 1. This liberty of condonation of delay is not available. The language that has been used is like this. It is substituted so far as commercial courts are concerned. It adds, the defendant shall forfeit the right to file the written statement and the court shall not allow the written statement to be taken on record. This provision has been interpreted by various high courts and also by the Honorable Supreme Court, and they say that instead of 90 days, 120 days has been given under the Commercial Courts Act, and it also adds, the Parliament has also added that the defendant shall forfeit his right to file the written statement and the written statement shall not be taken on record. Therefore, it is a mandate that has been given by the Parliament to the court that you shall not receive the written statement in a commercial cause if it is not filed within 120 days. If you don't file the written statement, that is the end of it. You can only argue your case on the basis of the plain evidence. Then, so far as the pleadings in a written statement is concerned, the general rule is that the denial should be specific. It is not sufficient if you say all the averments contained in the written, all the averments contained in the plaint, except those that are specifically admitted herein, are denied as false and incorrect. This will be the first paragraph of every written statement. And at the time of argument, when the court puts a question, have you denied this assertion in the plaint? The answer will be, in para 1, I have said that. That is not sufficient. CPC specifically says that the denial should be specific. Therefore, paragraph by paragraph, what is the assertion by the plaintiff? What is your case? You will have to deny it. General denial is not sufficient. Specific denial is necessary. And Order 8 Rule 2 CPC further says that apart from meeting the plaintiff's case, whatever is the additional defense which you are pleading, or whatever is the legal right on the basis of which you are pleading your defense. I am cautious. I am not saying that you should plead the law. I am saying that you should plead the material facts on the basis of which you say that the suit is not maintainable, or the suit is barred by limitation, or the suit is without jurisdiction, or that the plaintiff is not entitled to the relief, but you are entitled to the relief. Order 8 Rule 2, it reads like this. The defendant must raise, by way of his pleading, all matters which show that the suit is not maintainable, or that the transaction is either void or voidable in point of law, and all such grounds of defense as, if not raised, would be likely to take the opposite party by surprise, or would raise issues of fact not arising out of the plaint. as for instance, fraud, limitation, release, etc. Suppose I say that I am entitled to recovery of money. It is not sufficient if you simply deny that the borrower. If you say that there is a document which was executed and the document was executed under fraudulent circumstances, you will have to add in your written statement the fraudulent circumstance on the basis of which you allege that the document was obtained from you, so that other side will not be taken by surprise. He will be having the opportunity of meeting your case. See, ultimately, the requirement of pleadings is only to put the opposite party on notice of what is going to be your case, what is going to be the evidence which you are going to lead, what is the argument which you are going to make. Therefore, to keep him informed that, yes, there is a bill of exchange. That bill of exchange was obtained from me under undue influence. If you want to argue this, if you want to lead evidence for this, then there should be a specific plea in this regard as per Order 8, Rule 2. A mere denial of the document is not sufficient. Additional material particulars in support of the defendant also have to be pleaded. And one case for this will be interesting. 2011, 12 SEC, page 695. National Textile Corporation case. That is a case where the landlord who had let out the property to National Textile Corporation had filed the suit for eviction. In the Supreme Court, an argument was raised saying that National Textile Corporation is a wholly owned Government of India corporation. Therefore, government indirectly is the owner of the property, and therefore government is a necessary party to the suit. In the absence of the central government, the suit is bad for non-joinder of parties. The second plea that was taken is that the owner is the government. National Textile Corporation is occupying the property as the agent, and therefore an agent cannot be sued without impleading the known principal as a party. These are the two pleas which sought to be canvassed before the Honorable Supreme Court. Supreme Court, in that judgment, please mark paragraph 42 and 43. They have said that specific reference was made to Order 8, Rule 2. The plea was not taken in the written statement that National Textile Corporation is acting in the capacity as agent of the central government. Unless you plead in your written statement that the suit is not maintainable for the reason that central government is the principal, NTC is acting only as the agent, and therefore in the absence of making the principal as a party, the agent alone cannot be sued. Unless this plea is taken in the written statement, such an argument by you cannot be accepted, and therefore the Honorable Supreme Court negatived this argument and said that the order of eviction passed is correct and granted time for NTC to vacate the property and go. If such a plea had been taken in the written statement itself, this argument probably could have even convinced the Honorable Supreme Court. This argument was not allowed to be taken because of the rule. No amount of evidence can be admitted without a pleading. No argument can be made without a pleading. Since the pleading was not there as required under Order 8, Rule 2, this defense was not allowed to be taken. One more case, 2018, 7 SEC, page 646. It was a case arising out of a family dispute, partition, division of property, things like that. One of the documents which was relied upon was an exchange deed. That exchange deed was not registered. Therefore, the court held that the document is inadmissible and therefore you cannot look into that document. An alternative argument was made. Yes, the document cannot be relied upon for the purpose of substantive title. But still, for the purpose of Section 53A of the Transfer of Property Act, I am entitled to plead that I am in possession pursuant to a document, even if the document is unregistered. For the plea of 53A at that point of time, it was allowed. Therefore, don't dispossess me from the property. allow me to continue in this property was the plea that was taken by the defendant. This plea was accepted by the courts. But the Supreme Court said that in your written statement, as required under Order 8, Rule 2, you have not pleaded that your possession is pursuant to this agreement and pursuant to this contract, and therefore you are entitled to protect your possession. Such a plea is not there. When the plea is not there, you are not allowed to take such a plea before the Honorable Supreme Court, and therefore the decree for partition was confirmed and the plea to hold on to possession under 53A was negative. Then this is all with plain, special rules, and general rules and written statement. Apart from this, there are two things which has got to be added. One is set off. The other one is counterclaim. So far as set off is concerned, you are not asking for any relief over and above what the plaintiff has asked for. You only say that out of what the plaintiff is pleading, I am entitled to set off something, and therefore the decree has got to be granted, if at all, for a lesser amount. That has got to be specifically pleaded. And if such a plea is taken, the court will entertain that plea only if the cause of action for the suit as well as the cause of action for the set off arises on the same nature of transaction. A totally different transaction for which you could have filed a separate suit cannot be brought within the set off. Similarly, so far as counterclaim is concerned, Order 8, Rule 6A. Under Order 8, Rule 6, the particulars of set off has got to be given. Where in a suit for recovery of money, the defendant claims to set off against the plaintiff's demand any ascertained sum of money legally recoverable by him from the plaintiff, not exceeding the pecuniary limits of the jurisdiction of the court, and both parties fill in the same character as they fill in the plaintiff's suit, the defendant may, at the time of first hearing and not afterwards, he may say that there should be a set off. Therefore, for the purpose of set off, it is like a plaintiff's case. You say that, yes, the plaintiff claims that I am liable to pay 1 lakh. I am entitled to a set off. Suppose it is the transaction between a wholesaler and a retailer. The wholesaler says that I have supplied goods worth 1 lakh. The amount has not been paid. The defendant retailer, he may say that I am entitled to sales commission for having achieved certain targets, and therefore that has got to be set off. And plaintiff is not agreeing for that set off. Therefore, please reduce that amount from the suit claim. Here, what is important is the parties are having the same character. The wholesaler as the seller, the retailer as the buyer, and in the set off, the retailer as the buyer says I am entitled to certain commission, and therefore he can plead as a set off in this case. If it is not on the same character, if it is not on the same nature of transaction, then you can only file a separate suit. You cannot file it as a set off. That is the basic rule. That is the thread of Order 8, Rule 6. And similarly, Order 8, Rule 6A also. One question has come up frequently before courts, whether there is a limitation that is applicable for filing of the written statement, for filing of the counterclaim. Recently, in the present part, 2020, 2 CTC, I don't know the page number, Justice N.V. Ramana, 2020, 2 CTC, Supreme Court, page number you can just look up, Justice N.V. Ramana, they say that there is no limitation for filing the counterclaim. Only thing is, the relief which is sought for in the counterclaim should not be barred by limitation. That will be an issue that can be decided in the suit. But even if the counterclaim is not filed along with the written statement, it can be filed separately, provided that it is not unreasonably delayed. And whether it is reasonable or unreasonable or beyond reasonable time is a question of fact, which depends upon the facts and circumstances of each case. But at any rate, not beyond the framing of issues. Therefore, if a counterclaim has got to be filed, that counterclaim has to be filed within a reasonable time before issues are framed, and it should not be unreasonably delayed. These are the additional requirements so far as Order 8 is concerned, apart from written statement, set off, and counterclaim. If we have time, just 5 minutes, I can say on Order 7, Rule 11. Shall we do it or go to question answer?
So we have time, sir.
Okay. Order 7, Rule 11 is a provision where a plaint can be rejected. The defendant can file an application before the court for rejecting the plaint under certain circumstances. They are: 1, where it does not disclose a cause of action; 2, where the relief is undervalued and on being required by the court, the valuation has not been made good and the court fee has not been paid; where the relief claimed is properly valued, but the plaint is written on insufficiently stamped and proper court fee has not been paid within the time; and D, where the suit appears from the statement in the plaint to be barred by law. This is the most of the litigation will be on Order 7, Rule 11D. The reason is, cause of action, normally it will be there. If it is not there, then it deserves to be rejected. This is why we say that when the plaint is filed and drafted and filed, you should be very careful in collecting your material facts and put it in proper pleading along with the cause of action paragraph. If the cause of action is not there, then the plaint will be struck off under Order 7, Rule 11 CPC, under Order 7, Rule 11A. B and C is only with regard to valuation and court fees. Therefore, when it is pointed out by the court, obviously the plaintiff will rectify it. If he does not rectify it, then it deserves to be rejected. D, the suit appears from the statement in the plaint to be barred by law. Many applications are filed under Order 7, Rule 11D, saying that the plaintiff is not entitled to relief, the defendant is entitled to the relief, defendant has got a good defense, and things like that. Courts have repeatedly held, just like Section 482 CRPC, when you want to file a quash against the charge sheet, assuming everything which is contained in the charge sheet and the statements of all the witnesses, assuming that everything is true, even then, if the ingredients of the offense is not made out, then the charge sheet deserves to be quashed under 482. Applying the same principle here, without looking into the defense of the written statement, without looking into the contentions taken by the defendant in his affidavit saying that the plaintiff's case is wrong, by mere reading of the plaint, if you can come to the conclusion that the suit is not maintainable in law, then only Order 7, Rule 11D can be invoked. Otherwise, it will be a mere waste of time. Filing a petition for rejecting the plaint is only consuming the time of the court. Ultimately, it will be set aside by the Honorable Supreme Court, suit will be restored, and again we have to undergo the ordeal of trial. Therefore, reading of the plaint, if it does not make out a cause of action, or on a statement contained in the plaint itself, it is barred by law. Something like coming so squarely within re-litigation. The same issue was considered earlier, and that is mentioned in the plaint itself, and the second suit is filed. Then the defendant can say, please see the plaint. On seeing the plaint averments itself, it can be seen that the suit is not maintainable. Therefore, it deserves to be rejected. Under those circumstances, this can be done. So this is the sum and substance of the pleadings. And I again say that my endeavor was not to give any lecture for any seniors or any seasoned practitioners. It was intended only like a classroom lecture for the interns or for the budding lawyers who have just entered into the profession. Yes. Now questions, if any. And just one more thing, on a humorous note. See, as lawyers, we are trained in law. We are considered as an expert by the clients when he comes to us. And therefore, it is our duty to collect the facts from him, look into the law, draft the plaint as required under Order 7, order 6, order 7, order 8. We cannot say, like Vadivel said in the film London, தங்களுக்கு தெரியாத சட்டம் இல்லை, தாங்களே பார்த்து எனக்கு நல்ல தீர்ப்பு கூறவும். You should not say that like a party in person, that this is my facts, please give me the relief. That is not what a lawyer should say. A party in person may say, this is the facts, please give me the relief. Or Vadivel in a cinema may say, தங்களுக்கு தெரியாத சட்டம் இல்லை, தாங்களே பார்த்து தீர்ப்பு கூறவும். We as trained lawyers, as persons who are entering into the profession, and as persons who are walking in the portals of the court, are bound to know, are deemed to know the law. And therefore, when a plaint is filed, it has got to be filed in compliance with order 6, order 7, and a written statement should be filed in compliance with order 6 and order 8. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. As stated by everyone in the chat, that it was really a very enlightening session, sir. Like even for the juniors especially, but then for others who are not practicing in the civil side of the court also, sir, the importance of pleading is very, very necessary, sir. So thank you, sir, for enlightening us with this session. Now the platform is open for all our participants to ask any questions if you have. You can raise your hands in the app so that I can unmute you and you can ask the question directly, or you can send a message to me personally in the chat box so that I can put forward the question to sir. Any questions, please?
Any questions asking out of
yes, sir.
this?
Yes, sir. There is one question from Mr. V. Sendil Murugan. Or else I'll do one thing. I'll unmute everyone, and then we can ask questions after one minute. Participants, you can unmute yourself now, but you can raise your hands and ask questions one by one. So first question is coming up from Hema ma'am, sir. If I can unmute her. And...
After that, I have one question.
Sir,
sir, 1 minute, sir. We can just come next, sir. Sorry.
Yeah.
Hema ma'am, you can ask your question.
Sir, good morning. In fact, I don't have a question. I only wanted to say that on listening to you on order 6, 7, and 8 of CPC, regard to the pleadings, I had a feeling that this very same rules will also apply to a writ jurisdiction drafting, where you first have to plead your case and state the facts in a manner that everybody understands it. Therefore, your question is not for the advocates on the civil side alone, it is also for the advocates to practice on the writ jurisdiction.
Hello. Prithvi, can I ask a question?
Yes, sir. But I think Sundaresh sir mute 1 minute. Sir, are you able to hear us, sir? AR also?
Yes.
I think I will unmute everyone again. There is a lot of disturbances. You can please raise your hands and we can take questions one by one. Sir, you can answer, sir. Now.
Yes, Hema, was there any specific question by you? Hema Muralikrishnan, I think she.
There's some disturbance, sir. Yes, sir. I will just unmute her again. Hema, ma'am, can you repeat your question again, ma'am?
No, I did not have any question. I was saying that CPC pleadings looks like it also applies to writ jurisdiction also.
Principles of pleadings, the only difference in pleadings between petition and the plaint, civil proceedings and writ petition is this. When we say that the pleading should contain only the facts, not the evidence, there is a slight difference when it comes to a writ petition. Writ petition is filed on the basis of affidavit. Affidavit contains the pleading as well as evidence. Therefore, it is one bench higher. So far as writ petition is concerned, you also have to plead your evidence in the affidavit itself.
Yes, sir.
That is the only difference.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Partha sir wants to ask one question, so I'll just unmute him.
Yes.
Sir,
Good morning, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for the excellent lecture. I've just come on the last point, sir, on the rejection of plain under oral 7 Rule 11.
Yes.
As you correctly pointed out, that you assume everything in the pleading to be true and then decide whether the court has jurisdiction and don't go into the correctness of that.
Yes.
I found in some cases the fundamental pleading on the jurisdiction is so incorrect. The case goes through the court. No doubt, a question about jurisdiction or the cause of action is also framed the issues as a fundamental issue. But because of the again requirement that the courts will not decide each issue separately, but will decide all the issues, a party is unnecessarily forced to lead evidence and go through all other issues when probably this fundamental issue could have decided the case then and there. So is there something we can do about it, sir?
There are two ways at which you can look at it, sir. One is, there is one exceptional case where you can bring it within abuse of process. If you say that it is an abuse of process, then you can file a revision under Article 227 CRP and bring it to the notice of the court that this is forum shopping. Nothing has happened here. Whereas a meeting is to take place in Tuticorin. A suit is filed by someone like applying the principles of Morgan Stanley and other things. If it's a clear abuse of process, then under Article 227, you can ask for relief, but very, very exceptional. Or you can file an application for trying the question of jurisdiction as a preliminary issue under Order 14.
Okay.
Before compelling the parties to go on trial on all factual issues, let this issue be discussed as a preliminary issue.
So, as you rightly pointed out, sir, Article 227 threshold may be high, but maybe filing a separate application only for deciding the jurisdiction issue without getting into the evidence of others, that possibility is there. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sir, Ganimati ma'am also has a question, so I'll unmute.
Oh, she has only done all the preparation for me.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Prithvi. It was a nice lecture by your senior. Actually, somebody wants to know about the summary suit.
Order 37.
Sendil Kumar sir has...
you just explain what a summary suit is and what should be done in a summary suit.
So far as summary suit is concerned, it comes under when you file a suit on a negotiable instrument or a commercial document, then you can plead for granting a decree without an opportunity for the defendant to file a written statement itself. For that, there are additional requirements which are there. Those additional requirements are contained in Order 37. Therefore, before you file a suit, please go through Order 37.
Yes, that's what I want.
Order 37, Rule 2. A suit to which this order applies, if the plaintiff desires to proceed hereunder, be instituted by presenting the plaint which shall contain a specific averment to the effect that the suit is filed under this order. You have to specifically say, I am filing it as a summary proceeding, and no relief which does not fall within the ambit of the rule has been claimed, and the summons has got to be issued in a different form, saying that the defendant has got to file an application for leave to defend within a particular time. If he does not file application for leave to defend within a particular time, then the plaintiff has to file an application for judgment. Then if he files a summons for judgment, then the court will decree the suit without any written statement. All this is contained in Order 37, Rule 1, 2, 3 and 4.
Thank you, senior.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And thank you, sir, for telling about summary suit as well. I hope Sendil Kumar sir must have heard this also. Thank you, sir. Sir, there are like 4-5 questions, sir. If
Yes,
time permits for you, sir, we can take up these questions, sir.
I am free.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So, Mr. Madhusudana Reddy. I think we've lost him. I'm not able to connect. Krishnanan sir, Dr. Krishnanan sir.
I wanted to ask a last question because my question is not connected with what was spoken today.
Okay, so then we will come back.
Okay,
you.
then I'll ask the question.
Yes, sir.
Sir, yesterday we had 3 seniors.
Yes.
One of the issues spoken was time management. One of these spoken was time management.
Yes.
In fact, there is no introduction needed to you because I think you are available in every court hall almost every day throughout the year. How do you manage this? Number one. Number two, you're an avid sportsman. The cricket matches between the AG's 11 and the CGI 11, I have never seen you with a 0 score. You always score well. And how do you maintain your schedule with such a tough court work every day? I mean, we are unable to understand. After 2 cases or 3 cases, we feel we are totally worn out. And I literally see you running throughout the court halls, second floor to the first floor or the ground floor. How do you manage it, sir?
2 things: gift of God, support of juniors, and support of instructing councils like you. Nothing more.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I think Mr. Madhusudana Reddy has come online. He wants to ask one question, sir. I'll just unmute. Sir, I have unmuted you, sir.
Yeah. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
This is Madhusudan Reddy from.
Yes, sir.
I was a junior of S.A. Rajan in Bangalore for some time. I'm practicing now in Bangalore.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. My query is with regard to the commercial courts. As regards to when the CPC has come, there's slew of amendments made to CPC as regards to Commercial Courts Act.
Yes.
How far it is being used or used efficiently so that reliefs are given?
See, it's all a question of time management only. The object that is sought to be achieved in commercial courts by the Commercial Courts Act is that remedying avoiding the interference at the appellate stages during the pendency of suit. Number of appeals have been disallowed at the interlocutory stage, and trial evidence, all case management. Once case management comes, then you have to do it within a particular time. Then arguments has got to be given in writing, and then argument has got to be made within a particular time. So far as achieving the objects of the Commercial Courts Act is concerned, it's all in the hands of the presiding officers of the court, how strict they are and how the bar cooperates. The Parliament has done its job. Now it is for the courts and the bar to see that the objects are achieved. And it is being done mostly in IPR cases. It is being done mostly in IPR cases and commercial transactions. So far as Madras High Court is concerned, we are little keeping on time. Written statements are filed within 120 days. There is no question of continuation of delay. Once written statement is filed, then parties go in for case management, and under case management, the cases are being disposed of very quickly.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I'll take up 3-4 more questions, sir.
Yes.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, Mr. Vishwanathan wants to ask a question, sir.
My senior.
Yes, sir.
Sir, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
I don't have any questions, sir. I just want one more elaborate clarification on what you said about material fact and material particulars. What is the difference, sir? I could not understand that.
Sir, material fact is the fact on the basis of which you are claiming your relief.
Yes.
Material particulars is the fact on the basis of which you are proving the material fact. That is, if I say that, I am the owner of the property. I have let out the property to the tenant. I need the property for my owner's occupation, as owner's occupation. These are the material facts. And I should also plead that I do not have any other property of my own in my occupation. the material particulars may be that producing all the, if I'm in occupation of some other property, that property does not belong to me. It is a material particular. I'm in occupation of a tenanted property. Therefore, at the time of evidence, I can show that the property where I'm carrying on business does not belong to me. It belongs to my landlord, and I can produce the lease deed. I can produce proof of. Therefore, they are all material particulars. It is very clearly given by the Supreme Court in that if you read the judgment, facta probanda, facta probentia.
All right.
They say
2007 3 SSC 6 was the
facts which have to be proved, and facts on the basis of which it is going to be proved. The facts on the basis of which is going to be proved is material particulars. The facts which have to be proved is material facts. It's a very thin line of difference. That line of difference you may not understand. You will understand only on a case-to-case basis.
Thank you very much, sir. Good day, sir.
Thank you, sir. Kumar, sir.
Yes, okay. Sir, good evening, sir.
Sir, good evening. Good afternoon.
Sir, in a suit for recovery of possession,
yes,
the survey number of the suit property was wrongly mentioned, sir.
Yes.
Based on the sale deed itself.
Yes.
And the suit is decreed.
Mm.
How could it be executed, sir? At the time of execution, probably the village administrative officer would show some other property.
Mm.
But that is not my property. But the four boundaries is intact.
Yes. If the four boundaries are intact, then the only question which has got to be seen is that if both parties have understood that this is the property which is a subject matter of dispute, later on he cannot see. When you file your suit, file it properly. That is the best way of doing it. If you don't do it, there is a way. There is a way out. You have to show that parties understood what the subject matter of the dispute was, and both parties were fighting only for this property, and therefore once I succeed, the defendant cannot at the stage of execution say that no, we were fighting for a different property. Therefore, that is a matter of evidence. It's a matter of record. Through the records, you have to show that this is the four boundary, and his written statement also, he has understood that this is the property for which I am fighting, and now I have succeeded. Therefore, I am entitled to it. So it depends upon the identity of the property and the understanding between the two parties. Defendant should not think that he is trying to defend another property, and you should not think that you are fighting for some other property, and the court should not grant the decree. There should be an identity.
In the given case, sir, defendant is refusing the entire transaction. In case he has sold the property to me.
Yes.
By permission, he is in occupation.
Yes. No. That's a question which does not come under Order 6 or Order 7. You have to go to the Specific Relief Act and Transfer of Property Act. You have to establish title with regard to the property. Otherwise, the defendant being the vendor, he should show which property has sold it to you. So that will become a matter of evidence.
Yes, sir. Matter of evidence.
Having sold a property, he should say which property he has sold. Otherwise, if the judgment is wrong, you have to test it by way of appeal.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. Karthikeya, sir, you can ask your question.
Sir, good afternoon.
What? You have doubts?
I just have a small doubt, sir, with regard to the counterclaim which you have mentioned.
Yes.
Sir, Order 8, Rule 6A says the counterclaim has to be raised before the defense or the written statement is being filed.
Yes.
But recently, Supreme Court has now diluted this provision and says even after filing the written statement, you can still maintain a counterclaim.
Provided it is not unreasonably delayed.
Yes, sir. So is it not, sir, opposing to Rule 6A? Rule 6A does not give any leverage.
No.
See,
ultimately, see, the purpose of counterclaim is that when both parties are fighting on the same identity, avoid multiplicity of proceedings, because the defendant is always entitled to file a fresh suit for that cause of action which he is pleading. If that can be done by granting time here, then do it. That is why Supreme Court draws a line. If the suit has gone a long way, evidence has been recorded, in that don't derail the suit by entertaining a counterclaim at a later point of time. Whereas if the suit has not started, issues have not been framed, then don't go strictly by Order 8, Rule 6A. Allow the counterclaim to come in, because the identity of the claim of both parties is the same. They are fighting on the same relationship. Therefore, it will be better if the issue is decided in one suit itself. Therefore, if the suit has not traveled a long distance, entertain a counterclaim now and do justice between both parties. Therefore, the Supreme Court has exercised the power by holding that this is only procedural law. This is not a substantive law. Therefore, procedure being the handmaid of justice, in the interest of justice, time can be given, provided the the counterclaim is not barred by limitation. Therefore, instead of filing a separate suit and then clubbing the two suits together for adjudication, file it as a counterclaim. This is what the Supreme Court has exercised discretion in entertaining a written statement under Order 8, Rule 1 in Salem Bar Association case by saying that even if it is not filed within 90 days, extend the time. Similarly, if a counterclaim is not filed within the time of filing the written statement, even then it is not barred, you can entertain it. But that is the law. Article 141, 142. Article 141.
Thank you, sir.
Karthik, am I clear?
Yes, sir. Sir, he is muted himself. I'll again unmute him. But I think it is clear, sir.
Okay.
One.
Sir, I got cleared, sir.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Sir, Mr. Siva sir has one question. I'll just. Siva sir, you can ask your question, sir.
Sir, good afternoon, sir.
Yes, good afternoon.
Sir, as a blessing in disguise, this COVID lockdown has brought great legendary lectures like you, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for enlightening us.
Okay, thank you.
And my question is this, sir. What is the difference between reply to written statement and rejoinder, sir?
Reply to the written statement. See, actually, there is all these names have been given by us on our own. Order 8, Rule 9 only says there shall be no pleading without the leave of the court after the written statement is filed. Just 1 minute. It only says subsequent pleading. No pleading subsequent to the written statement of a defendant other than by way of defense to a set-off or counterclaim shall be presented except with the leave of the court and upon such terms. Therefore, it is all only a subsequent pleading. Whether it is a rejoinder or it is a reply statement, it really makes no difference. When a written statement is filed, bringing out some new case and you want to meet it, then you are filing your reply statement to that. That's all.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Sir, sir, there has been a special request sent to me where
Yes.
there are many civil judge aspirants who wants to go onto the path of judgeship. So they are asking tips how to remember orders and connect with the section. What are the tips which you can give, sir, to be good with CPC? So any advice, sir, on that?
Have one handy book with you. Have a picturesque memory. When you read, you try to picturize that page. You will know that. And don't concentrate on too many simple matters. There are when you read the CPC along with a CPC textbook, you will know the headings on which there is more emphasis. Therefore, when you see that headings on which there is more emphasis, you'll be able to remember that. And then have chronology, pleadings in general, then plaint, then written statement, then the chronology in which the CPC has been framed, and that picturesque memory and chronology, it will help you to remember.
Thank you very much, sir, for your advice. Sir, one more last, they are asking your point of view about this, sir. Mr. Sendil Kumar is asking, in practice, the court is asking us to apply for certified copies. Is it correct, sir? What is your opinion on that?
Certified copies of?
Certified copies of documents and other pleading sets or whatever, sir. Like when we go before the master court or when we go for giving in evidences, a lot of times the court also asks us to apply for certified copies.
So far as so far as CPC is concerned, it says that along with the plaint, the document should be filed. It does not say that when summons are served, copy of the plaint has got to be served. It does not say along with the copy of plaint, copy of documents has got to be served. Copy of documents has got to be served only in one case, where ex parte injunction is granted under Order 39. Then Order 39 Rule 3 says that along with the plaint, affidavit and the document which are relied upon, all that has got to be communicated within 24 hours. Therefore, in a case where ex parte injunction has been granted, then CPC imposes a condition that you are bound to, the plaintiff is bound to provide all the papers. In other cases, it is not there. But in fairness, the plaintiff's counsel can be asked by the defendant to please give one set of documents, or you are only entitled to inspection. You can give notice to him, I want to come to your office and inspect all the documents, therefore keep all the documents ready. Otherwise, if you want documents to have it in your office and sit and prepare your case, then you have to file application for certificate copy, because CPC does not mandate that copies of documents should be given by the plaintiff to the defendant.
Sir, one last question, sir. Last question for the day, sir.
Yeah.
So the query is, when a case is posted for pronouncement of judgment, can Order 7, Rule 17, Rule 14 be invoked, or can an application for reopen or recall of witness be filed?
It depends upon the facts of the case only. You have to establish that you were prevented by sufficient cause from bringing your witness on that day, and therefore reopen the case.
Thank you, sir. Sir, actually, just on a lighter, this question was asked by my wife, sir.
Oh, right. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Sir, I'll just invite Mr. Srinivas to just say a few words.
Yes.
Before we end the session, sir. APS, sir.
Yes, sir. Sir, we thank you, sir, on behalf of Madras Tax Bar. We all know about your speed delivery of lectures, sir. We are all seen in the court. Today, one more session we had, sir. It just reminded me of one Thirukural, sir. Let me say that Solalvalan, Sorvalan, Anjanavane, Helvellal, Yarkum, Aridu. You proved to that, sir. We are thank you for spending your valuable time, sir, and educating us on the law of pleadings. And you have given a new dimension to the filing of setting the limitation for filing written statements, sir. Now, recently, Justice S.M. Subramaniam has also emphasized that, saying that within 90 days it has to be filed. So far as counters in writ petitions also concerned. And you have given a new dimension by saying that it's a new case for the defendant is concerned. And by touching the counterclaim, set off, and summary suit and rejection of plaints, sir, you have almost covered all the parts of area of pleadings till the case is listed for final hearing, sir. We really benefited by your today's lecture, sir. I once again thank you for your valuable lecture, sir. I kindly look forward to you soon on some other topic also in our webinar series, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is my honor to be amidst all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for